If a person intended to cheat on his spouse, but at the last moment he got stuck and did not cheat, would this be considered adultery? My wife's friend was a real snake who manipulated my wife and pushed her to cheat. I saw the red signals in time and started acting. In their early 40s, a couple followed my wife and her boyfriend, not yet her lover, into the hotel. Fortunately for me, I trailed behind them, unseen by my wife and her companion. I recalled what the receptionist had mentioned during our earlier conversation. My wife, Shelley, and her potential lover, Harold, each carried small bags. He had his arm around her waist, and they were impeccably dressed, trying to pass as a married couple, though Shelley appeared to be resisting his touch. She glanced up at the large mirror behind the reception desk. Contrastingly, the couple behind them was distinct. The man lugged a sizable suitcase and several garment bags, while the woman carried a small overnight bag. They were dressed in practical travel attire, suggesting they were married and well prepared for a weekend getaway. I managed to snap a few photos of my wife and Harold reflected in the mirror. I observed as Harold handled the check-in process. The receptionist glanced at me, I nodded, and she smiled in return, seemingly enjoying herself. I could sense the dynamics unfolding. Amidst some muttered curses, I noticed Shelley distancing herself from Harold. As she turned away, the receptionist said something that caught her attention, prompting her to pause. She then handed my wife the envelope I had provided. Eventually, the couple ahead of me exchanged a glance, communicating silently, and the man let out a loud harumph. Then things began to move swiftly. My wife hurried out with her small suitcase in tow. The receptionist handed Harold the second envelope I had given her. With that, I turned and made my way towards the exit. And thus begins the tale of how we arrived here and what unfolded thereafter. It all began at my wife Shelley's Christmas company party. We were there with her friend Dee and her husband, Frank. I wasn't particularly fond of Dee, but Frank was tolerable. We'd converse casually. He seemed decent, though we didn't share many interests. He enjoyed golf and cricket, while my main passions revolved around vintage cars, DIY projects, and gardening. Dee and Shelley had been friends since high school, and even ended up working at the same bank, albeit in different departments. As Frank and I returned with our drinks, I trailed just behind Shelley when I overheard her saying, "I wouldn't mind having his slippers next to my bed." I glanced across the room and noticed everyone's attention focused on Harold Galt. He had recently joined the bank, which had sparked quite a buzz among the female staff. Standing just over 6 feet tall, weighing around 12 stone, with neatly styled blonde wavy hair, he exuded a certain charm reminiscent of a Greek Adonis. Despite being on the same level as Shelley and Dee, he appeared at ease conversing with the bank's higher-ups, radiating confidence. A young, attractive blonde stood by his side, his arm casually draped around her waist. I had spoken with him before, and his demeanor exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance, reminiscent of Frank. Although he seemed pleasant enough, we didn't share any common interests. "Why are my slippers next to your bed?" I queried. Frank chimed in. And I doubt his blonde companion would appreciate finding his slippers there. "Who is she?" Dee interjected. "That's his wife, Mary. They've been married for 5 years and have a 2-year-old son named Philip, I believe. But she's dealing with some issues. She seemed to possess more information but chose not to elaborate on the specifics of the issues." I glanced at Shelley wearing my unhappy expression. With a serious tone, I uttered, "If you fancy someone else's slippers by your bedside, file for divorce first." With that, I headed to the restroom. I didn't actually need to use the toilet. I was simply expressing my displeasure. Upon returning, Shelley apologized, explaining, "It's just a saying, honey. I wouldn't betray you." I responded firmly, "If I discover anyone else's slippers near a bed you've been in, I'll end our marriage." Dee interjected, "Rob, don't be so harsh." Shelley reassured me, "I'd never do that to you, darling. I love you." She took a sip of her drink, then lowered her gaze, appearing contrite. Dee teased, "I'm sure Rob would forgive a slip-up." I shot Dee a glare, to which she responded with a playful, "Puffed." Frank echoed similar sentiments to Dee, but her reaction was starkly different. She laughed and quipped, "You wouldn't divorce me, sweetheart. You adore me too much. You'd forgive me for one mistake, wouldn't you?" I'd never heard Frank swear before. "Don't even think about it. You might not like the outcome." Dee's expression changed suddenly. Then she lightly tapped Frank on the arm and said, "I wouldn't do that. But even if I did, you wouldn't divorce me. You love me." I don't know Frank well, but judging from his manner, I hope she doesn't make a mistake. That's when I realized why I didn't care for her. She took everyone, including her obviously devoted husband, for granted. The conversation troubled me a bit. Shelley tended to emulate Dee, not always, but often enough to worry me. I expressed my discontent to Shelley about following Dee's sometimes questionable advice. I reminded her that she had her own mind, but Dee seemed adept at influencing her. I had cautioned her to be independent. Things settled down somewhat after that, though I did observe both Dee and Shelley casting glances at Harold. But Dee's expression betrayed desire. She even approached Harold for a dance when Frank stepped away. From the outside, it would seem like Harold had asked Dee, and it was a slow one. At Shelley's company party, I took the wheel, reciprocating for when it was my company's event. We had that kind of understanding. After dropping off Dee and Frank at their house, we continued home in silence, the chill of the night enveloping us. In a hushed tone, I expressed my concern about Dee potentially pursuing an affair with Harold, emphasizing the disrespect it would entail towards her marriage and Harold's wife. I made it clear that assisting her in any way would cast doubt on our marriage and future. She remained silent. As the weekend progressed, the atmosphere thawed, and communication resumed its normal pace. Shelley received several texts from Dee, each accompanied by the distinct sound of a giggling frog. On Saturday night, as we prepared for bed, I retrieved an old pair of slippers from the depths of my wardrobe and placed them on her side, a playful hint. She chuckled, and our connection rekindled as we made love. Afterward, everything returned to its usual rhythm. But I remained vigilant, observing her attire and the time she returned home. I made sure to do things I knew she enjoyed, demonstrating my love for her and showcasing what she would miss if she ever strayed or aided a cheater. We didn't speak of Harold again. My concern wasn't so much about her cheating, but about her potentially assisting Dee in cheating on Frank. Occasionally, I subtly reminded her of the consequences if I caught her aiding Dee in infidelity. I highlighted how easily celebrities disregard their vows and emphasized the importance of fidelity. I shared anecdotes, both real and fictional, about spouses discovering their partner's infidelity, making it clear that if she ever betrayed me, I would vanish, without a trace. One evening I was out with my coworkers, not our usual spot, but one of them had a crush on the bartender. To my surprise, I spotted Dee there, cozying up to Harold. When I mentioned it to Shelley later, she quickly pointed out that they worked together. However, I had taken a photo as evidence, which I showed to Shelley. Her immediate response was that they were also friends, almost as if she had rehearsed her defense in advance. "Does Frank know about this friendship, or is he off playing golf?" I was aware that he often went on golfing weekends. She turned away and headed upstairs to bed. I grabbed another beer and followed suit. As I sat on my side of the bed, I inquired, "Were you aware of Dee's rendezvous?" She replied softly, "She mentioned she might see him this weekend. Does Frank have any idea?" "I'm not sure," she murmured, rolling over to look at me. "I don't want to get involved." I recognized that look, and I believed her. I slipped into bed beside her, wrapped my arms around her, gave her a warm smile, and then a tender kiss before pulling her close to my shoulder, one of her favorite places. No further words were necessary. A week later, following a lengthy phone conversation with her mother, Shelley inquired if we could visit her parents in a few weeks' time. They had some minor tasks that needed attention. I had a positive impression of Mavis and David, so I didn't mind at all. We drove to Gloucester on Friday. By the time we arrived, it was too late to do much, so Shelley and her mom caught up, discussing Shelley's old friends, family updates, and local gossip. David and I chimed in occasionally and enjoyed a few beers. The next day, we spent quality time with Shelley's parents. I tackled some tasks I wanted to help them with. Despite David being only 65, he struggled with arthritis in his hands, which made it difficult for him to handle intricate tasks. I was happy to lend a hand. In the evening, we went out for dinner, mainly so the older folks could enjoy a drink. I took the wheel. Near the end of the meal, Shelley's phone started making that irritating frog-like sound. She didn't even glance at it, just switched it to silent mode. That's the beauty of texts. You can deal with them later. The food was delicious and the company was delightful. On the way home, I could still hear her phone buzzing. Once we arrived home, we had a few more drinks. David had brought me some crafty old hen, so I had a couple of bottles of that. The others were a bit tipsy when they headed upstairs. It had been a wonderful evening. However, I couldn't shake off the thought about the texts from Dee. There were quite a few of them. We eventually went to bed and Shelley was feeling a bit romantic. But it didn't feel appropriate with her parents in the next room. It was strange because back when we were dating, we didn't mind their presence. Sometimes they were even wide awake, not asleep like they were now. Around 1 a.m, I felt the urge to use the restroom, courtesy of the crafty old hen. Spotting Shelley's phone on the dressing table, I couldn't resist checking it when it vibrated and lit up. Dee had sent a message at such an odd hour. Curiosity got the better of me. It was just a preview, but the content was startling. Oh my God, he's fantastic. You have to try him, even just once. The preview cut off there. Despite knowing I shouldn't, I took the phone with me to the toilet. We knew each other's passcodes. Opening Dee's message folder, I found only previews, indicating Shelley hadn't seen them yet. However, it was clear from what I read that she had spent the night with Harold, and all that implied. I speculated whether this weekend getaway was disguised as a spa retreat for Frank's Barat. Without his contact information, I couldn't confirm anything. I refrained from opening any messages, finished my business, and refrained from flushing to avoid waking Shelley or alerting her to my snooping. I woke up early on Sunday to complete some tasks around the house for David. By the time they all came downstairs around 9, I had already prepared the tea. As Shelley placed her phone on the induction charger, it illuminated. It seemed she hadn't checked any of the messages from Dee, although I couldn't be certain. Dee and Frank seemed to have kept you busy with all those messages last night. Anything noteworthy? I inquired. I believe she had forgotten about the messages until I mentioned them. She glanced at her phone, then hurriedly disappeared into another room. I could hear her conversing with Dee, but couldn't make out their discussion. When she returned, her face was flushed. Something had transpired. After sorting everything out, we packed the car and set off for home. While we were settled on the M5 heading north, I remarked to Shelley, "It sounds like Dee had a busy weekend." I didn't mention Frank's name, only Dee's. "Yes, I think they had a good weekend," she responded. As we neared home, there was little conversation in the car. Shelley appeared deep in thought. After exiting the motorway, we came to a stop at some traffic lights. Feeling uneasy, I decided to address the issue directly. Turning to face Shelley, I spoke frankly. "If I discover that Dee has been involved with Harold this weekend and you facilitated it by arranging this visit to your parents, I won't be able to forgive you. It will seriously make me reconsider our marriage because I explicitly warned against it." Just then, the lights changed and the car behind us honked impatiently. The remainder of the drive home, about 10 miles, was filled with silence. When I stole a glance at Shelley, she was staring at her hands in her lap. Damn, she looked guilty. We arrived home, and feeling it might be a touch early, I decided it was beer o'clock. Meanwhile, Shelley headed upstairs to unpack and toss the dirty laundry into the hamper. When she returned downstairs, it seemed she'd shed a few tears, her eyes slightly reddened. She suggested grabbing Chinese takeout for dinner to spare us cooking, and I readily agreed, having already indulged in a beer. Upon her return with the Chinese food, she surprised me by also picking up some more crafty old hen from the nearby supermarket. I couldn't help but wonder if she'd spoken to Dee while she was out. I had already set the table and prepared everything. She appeared rather quiet as we sat down for dinner. About halfway through, she confided in me, saying, "Darling, I didn't help Dee, but I did inform her that we're going away this weekend. It wasn't anything special. I arranged it so you could assist Dad with his hand issues. I never intended for her to use it as an opportunity to be with Harold. But it seems she took advantage knowing you and Frank move in different circles." "I'm sorry, darling. I didn't anticipate her actions. But from the numerous text messages and conversations I've had, it's clear she has indeed done it. I'm torn. Should I tell Frank or stay out of it? She's my closest friend and she's destroyed her marriage. What you need to do is reflect on it and make your own decision. The one you can live with, knowing it's the right thing to do," I replied. "And most importantly, you'll need to face Frank the next time we see them together." After watching some TV, I had a couple more beers and we went to bed. There was no intimacy, just cuddling. Just before I drifted off, I'm certain she whispered, "I'm sorry, darling." She arrived home late from work on Monday, and even though she called me to let me know, I still felt concerned. Over dinner, she mentioned having a lengthy conversation with Dee, getting some unsettling details, but she chose not to share them with me, which I appreciated. She made it clear to Dee that while she kept their conversation confidential this time, she wouldn't hesitate to act differently if a similar situation arose again. Furthermore, she asserted that if Frank posed a direct question, she wouldn't deceive him. She informed Dee that she wouldn't condone any infidelity and cautioned her about the potential consequences it could have on her marriage, emphasizing that Frank might leave her. Despite laughing off a remark about slippers at the Christmas party, it became apparent that Frank didn't find it amusing. He was quite serious about it. Dee assured her it was a one-time occurrence, but she decided it was too risky to continue. Harold wasn't eager for a repeat either, fearing repercussions from his wife. Discovering the truth, especially given the prenuptial agreement and the skepticism from Harold's father-in-law. Things calmed down at home for a couple of months. One afternoon, I popped into the nearby newsagent to grab a car magazine and headed to a coffee shop for a quiet read away from the office chatter. That's when I noticed Martin, one of the younger guys from our office, entering with a woman from the sales department. She appeared slightly older than him and quite attractive. While Martin was handsome himself, I always considered him a bit naive. They ordered their drinks and took a seat in the booth behind me. I overheard her apologizing to Martin for a misunderstanding over the weekend. Apparently, her husband had become suspicious, leading her to cancel their Saturday night plans. She mentioned avoiding late-night work for a while and being cautious about her attire and time spent with Martin. She confessed that her husband noticed what she wore to work and admitted feeling guilty. Hence, she increased intimacy with her husband to deflect his suspicions. However, she implied that Martin fulfilled her needs better than her husband ever could. I encountered Martin near the printer while he was alone, or rather, I engineered the encounter. I shared with him what I had heard, cautioning him to proceed with care, although I acknowledged it wasn't my place to intervene. He confided in me that she had disclosed her husband's abusive behavior and her inability to leave him due to their children. Once our conversation began, he delved into the challenges they faced in meeting clandestinely and concealing it from her husband. It seemed as though he found relief in unburdening himself, despite needing to keep it secret from his colleagues. I cautioned him that while the company might turn a blind eye as long as it didn't affect their work, if her husband were to find out, it would lead to serious repercussions. It felt like I had stumbled upon a sort of unofficial guide to infidelity. I grew increasingly concerned upon seeing Shelley's phone. It displayed Dee's icon, but the irritating frog sound was absent. Why the change? After my conversation with Martin, I was alerted to what to watch for. I observed her clothing, makeup, everything. Yet, there was no deviation. Always the same style of skirt, the same blouses, similar shoes. Previously, her attire varied with the weather, but now it was consistently identical. She never arrived late from work without a phone call. Even when she went out with her colleagues, she never stayed out late and often requested that I pick her up. This routine had persisted for about 5 weeks. Something felt off. Yet the intimacy between us was satisfying, which also troubled me, although I couldn't complain too much about that. I attempted to access her phone, but she had changed the passcode. When I inquired, she explained that someone at her workplace had witnessed her entering it, prompting her to change it without informing me. She disclosed the new passcode to me on the spot. It would have seemed suspicious to check her phone in her presence. She often left it charging overnight, so that's when I took the opportunity to check it. I found nothing conspicuous. A sense of unease crept over me, intensifying during their bank's summer BBQ. Frank was absent, off playing golf for the weekend. Consequently, Dee stuck with us the whole time. I had already planned for us to take a taxi home, so I pretended to drink more than usual and made frequent trips to the restroom. I feigned being slightly intoxicated to lower their vigilance. It proved effective. I went to grab more drinks and found no line at the bar, so I returned much faster than before. When I got back, I noticed Shelley and Dee had relocated to a secluded area of the garden. Wondering why, I approached quietly and overheard Dee saying to Shelley, "Everything's set up perfectly. It's foolproof. You won't get caught. As you informed me, we took care of every detail, from the outfit and timing to the bedding aspect. I've even registered you for the symposium. If you don't show up, I'll cover for you with an excuse. I've arranged your travel and booked a hotel room under your name at the Symposium Hotel, just in case Rob checks. It's a one-time thing anyway. I'm still uncertain. Once I figure it out, Rob will recognize the guilt. You won't get caught. What's the harm? Just seduce him plenty. Men are simple. I'm still undecided about taking the risk. Hush, he'll return soon. We can discuss it at work. I'll inform you about the actual hotel details in person, remember? No electronic traces." There were no names mentioned, and their conversation could have been about anything. But based on what I observed, I suspected it was a rendezvous with Harold. I just had to wait. After dropping Dee off and heading back home in the taxi, I said to Shelley, "I noticed you eyeing Harold. If I discover his belongings anywhere near a bed you've slept in, I'm leaving you. Just as I've said before, I'll be gone." Suddenly, I wasn't as intoxicated. She glanced at me, fully understanding my implication. She didn't respond, just stared out the window. I expressed my happiness for her when she returned home, excitedly discussing the symposium she was set to attend on behalf of the bank. When I inquired about the symposium's topic, sensing her unease, she responded, "Banking in the 2030s. It sounded improbable, but I maintained my enthusiasm just in case I was mistaken, and there was indeed such an event. Upon investigation, I discovered that the symposium did exist, as she confirmed later at the hotel. So why was she flustered? The symposium was scheduled for Friday, prompting her to opt for an early departure on Thursday afternoon to avoid the Friday morning traffic. It seemed like a reasonable plan. However, I suspected that the hotel room would remain vacant, while Shelley rendezvoused with Harold elsewhere. It would be foolish for her, or Dee for that matter, to meet him in the same hotel where many banking professionals, including some of her colleagues, were staying. We seldom spent time apart, so I suggested accompanying her for the weekend at the hotel to make a getaway of it, something we had done once or twice before. She became flustered and mentioned being tired after the symposium, preferring to be at home with her husband in her own bed. Since she still needed to attend the symposium early the next morning, I started looking for nearby hotels. There were quite a few options, which was inconvenient. Despite my doubts about whether this was an illicit meeting, I decided Shelley needed to make her own choices regarding our marriage, despite my numerous warnings. I loved her and was willing to give her one last chance, but I wanted to see how she planned to rebuild trust. I suspected Dee was influencing her despite my warnings. A week before the symposium, my suspicions grew even stronger. The bank had an office party, and I offered to pick them up afterward as usual. It would have been suspicious if they declined, so they didn't resist much. I insisted. I arrived early and quietly settled down in a corner where music was playing and several people were dancing. I noticed how Harold took Shelley to the dance floor, but in the middle of the song she seemed to stumble. I took out my phone and looked around. No one seemed to be paying attention to me except Dee. Then I saw Harold touch Shelley. I expected a reaction, but nothing happened. I discreetly photographed this incident. Later, they exchanged a kiss, although it was not particularly passionate. I also captured this moment on camera. The music ceased, and Harold and Shelley rejoined the crowd. Shortly after they returned to their table, I arrived. Shelley appeared visibly intoxicated, which was unusual for her. She typically handles her alcohol well and is quite cautious. When she noticed me, she blushed. I wasn't pleased with what I observed, although it wasn't grounds for divorce. I resolved to issue more warnings about infidelity in the future. During the car ride home, I inquired whether Harold or Dee were attending the symposium. Shelley responded that she didn't know. While waiting at a red light, I glanced at her and remarked, "I find it hard to believe you wouldn't know if a colleague was attending the same symposium as you. I won't be pleased if you're lying to me." The traffic signal had switched to green, so I only managed a quick glance at her as I drove away. She was staring down at her lap. I spoke up. "You know my stance on dishonesty. If people are sneaking around and you aid them in hiding it, I'll assume you endorse cheating and might engage in it yourself. And if you ever betray my trust, I'll leave. Just disappear. You won't see me again." At that moment, I became convinced that something fishy was going on. But how could I confirm it? My suspicion centered on the symposium, so I decided to play detective and tail her. Then, a breakthrough. I had stopped snooping on her phone after Dee's warning about no electronics, but I happened to notice Shelley's phone lighting up. "Best Western Solihull. Mrs. Jones, your confirmation." Our last name isn't Jones, and the Symposium Hotel was a Best Western in Coventry, not too far from there. Later, when I checked her phone, the message was nowhere to be found, not even in the recycle bin. I'd caught them. I had multiple thoughts swirling in my mind. Giving her a final opportunity, I took proactive steps by consulting our lawyers and initiating separation proceedings. I obtained a separation letter as a precursor to divorce, and even acquired a divorce petition online for added impact. However, I doubted she would actually pursue it if given the choice. Nevertheless, I felt compelled to take precautions to prevent a recurrence. Yet, even if she didn't proceed with the divorce, what would I do? My dilemma stemmed from my deep love for her, tempered by a firm boundary. Allowing another person into her life in such a way was unacceptable to me. If she abstained, we could focus on rebuilding trust, though it would be a challenging journey with no guarantee of success. The closeness on Wednesday night was incredible, although I couldn't shake the guilt. Shelley promised another date this weekend. I booked a room at the Solihull Hotel, still not knowing what might happen. Taking a day off, I arrived early and entered into a lengthy conversation with the administrator about adultery and secret relationships. She shared her thoughts on how to recognize cheating couples. Spouses tend to be practical rather than gentle. The husband is burdened with luggage and the wife carries a small bag. However, if they are having an affair, both carry small bags. The man takes the initiative in the conversation and often demonstrates physical affection. The receptionist found it all funny, and she agreed that my suggestion of Mr. and Mrs. Jones would add a humorous touch, especially if it was captured by surveillance cameras. However, it cost £20. I observed Harold and Shelley arrive and trailed them into the building. A mature couple stood between us. They entered just as the receptionist had described the lovers. I snapped a photo, pondering how long their romantic gaze would endure. I overheard him inform the receptionist, "We're booked in as Mr. and Mrs. Jones." The receptionist glanced at me and I nodded. "Of course, sir," she replied, tapping away at the computer. After handing him a key card, she instructed him to fill out a vehicle registration form. I had orchestrated this part with the receptionist, who seemed to find it amusing. She glanced at my wife, who stood next to her would-be lover, and smiled. Then everything changed. Shelley's body trembled and she pulled away from Harold, shaking her head. I believe she was murmuring, "No, no, no, I can't." Harold looked bewildered. Undeterred, the receptionist continued, "The hotel isn't concerned with the names you provide. However, I believe your real name is Mrs. Shelley Harris." My wife staggered, distancing herself from Harold. Unfazed, the receptionist added, "I have this envelope for you. Have a nice day," and handed over the envelope I had given her. With that, she returned her attention to the computer. My wife stood there holding the envelope, and the receptionist suggested, "Perhaps you should open that before heading to your room." I hadn't prompted her, but it was a wise suggestion. Shelley remained motionless. Harold took the envelope from her and opened it, exclaiming, "Oh no." Passing the contents to Shelley, she examined the photos of them kissing. Opening the folded paper revealed an unsigned divorce petition and a separation letter. A note accompanied it stating, "What you do in the next 30 seconds will determine if you receive a signed divorce petition." Though I timed her, the actual time didn't matter. Her actions did. The couple behind them made a noise, startling them into action. Shelley turned and sprinted toward the hotel's entrance, passing me without a glance back. Harold stood there, looking bewildered. The receptionist handed him an envelope saying, "This is for you, Mr. Galt." Inside was a letter. "Your wife has received copies of the pictures and details of your planned night. Have a good evening." It was unsigned. I stepped outside. Shelley was making a call on her phone as I made my way to my Land Rover. Suddenly, my phone began ringing with her distinctive ringtone. Looking up, she spotted me. "Need a ride somewhere?" I called out. Dropping her case, she hurried towards me. "I'm really sorry," she said. I gestured towards the passenger door. "Hop in." Tears streamed down her face as she climbed into the car. I retrieved her suitcase and stowed it in the back of the Land Rover. "I'm sorry, darling. I got pulled into this mess by Dee," she continued. I chose not to respond. "Which car is his?" "That black Audi over there." She pointed to a black Mercedes parked under the trees. "Are you sure that's an Audi?" "Yes, I'm sure. He parked it there to keep it hidden," she explained. It was actually a Mercedes EQB SUV, a $50,000 vehicle. How could he afford that on his salary? It must be close to what Shelley earns. I pondered whether his wife had money or if it was inherited wealth, but those thoughts could wait. I had other matters to attend to. I turned to Shelley and cautioned her, "Do not attempt to call him." She swiftly retrieved her phone from her handbag and handed it to me. Was it because she lacked trust in herself? Or was she trying to convey her remorse? I slipped it into my pocket, having other tasks at hand. Heading to the rear of my Land Rover, I fetched some tools. Owning a Land Rover necessitates carrying tools. Pausing briefly, I sent a pre-written email from my phone. Then I approached the back of his car, mindful of any operational CCTV cameras. Not that it concerned me. I was prepared to face probation or a fine for the damage. My snips effortlessly removed all the tire valves, while the Stanley knife inflicted slashes on each tire sidewall. Despite being run flats, they wouldn't deflate. But the car wouldn't be roadworthy, necessitating the replacement of all tires. Next, I used a 2-pound ball peen hammer to shatter the windscreen directly in the driver's line of sight. It exceeded my expectations. The crack spread in multiple directions, triggering the car alarm. Returning to the Land Rover, I asked, "Can we leave now, please?" Not just yet. I'm not done here, I replied. Please? I ignored her as the hotel doors swung open. Harold burst out, dragging his suitcase, his phone wedged between his shoulder and ear as he fumbled with the car alarm. I managed to capture a photo of him, the hotel sign clearly visible. I sent it to his wife, too. With my windows down, I overheard his conversation. Sweetheart, it's not what it seems. I'd never betray you. I'm just entering the hotel. I'm on a course, you know that. He paused, then continued. No, I was just assisting her. He hopped into his car, then noticed the condition of the windshield. Exiting the car, still on the phone, he exclaimed, Sweetheart, that's not me. I didn't do that. Suddenly, his phone pinged and I heard him curse. I wondered if it was the photo of him touching Shelley or the one of them entering the hotel arm in arm. Despite being taken from behind, their identities were clear, thanks to the mirror reflecting their faces at the reception desk. Or perhaps it was the image of him leaving the hotel he claimed to be entering. Regardless, the damage was done. Now it's time to leave. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. Shelley remained seated, tears streaming down her face. Despite her attempts to speak, she couldn't find the words. All I could hear were her whispers of, I'm sorry. As she composed herself, she turned towards me and pleaded, Darling, can we pull over and talk? I wasn't in the mood for conversation, but it was inevitable. She hadn't noticed our direction. Not while I'm driving, at the next highway stop. It was then she glanced out and realized we were heading south on the M5, not north, towards home. Where are we going? She asked. To your parents. Please no, it would devastate them. You love them. You wouldn't do that. I shot her a look and muttered, I didn't. She burst into tears once more. I didn't intend to, but she was unaware of that. I confronted her. Did you believe there wouldn't be consequences when you began an affair with Harold? She justified it, claiming we had planned it meticulously to avoid detection. It was meant to be a one-time thing, harmless just for the experience, with no intention of hurting anyone. Her excuses poured out amid tears, making me wonder if Dee had used similar justifications to convince her. Likely. I pondered, was Dee acting as Harold's procurer, arranging his affairs for him? It would certainly stir things up at the bank. Perhaps I should suggest it, even if it's not true. When you say we, you mean you and Dee, correct? I noticed her nod in agreement. I'm curious. What did you expect would happen if you were caught? Dee isn't risking her marriage this time. The next stop is just over a mile away. You have 30 minutes to persuade me not to take you to your parents' house. She began to speak, but I raised my hand to silence her. She remained seated, gazing out the window. Upon reaching the service station, I parked the car and instructed her to locate a quiet spot while I fetched some drinks. At the counter, I ordered 2 teas despite knowing her aversion to them, but detestation for motorway stop tea surpassed her preference. As she reluctantly took a sip, her expression twisted in displeasure. She had anticipated a latte. Her glare communicated, fair enough. She remained seated until I prompted, You have 27 minutes left. Though the time was irrelevant, the words carried weight. I know I vowed at the altar, and while technically unbroken, I've teetered so close it's inconsequential. I've deceived you, kept secrets, and disregarded our marriage vows. I can't guarantee your belief, but I swear I won't repeat it. Let's just say I've learned my lesson. I'll cut ties with Dee and resign from the bank if necessary. She seems to exercise independent thought when Dee isn't influencing her. Shelley elaborated. Dee assured me it would be discreet. You wouldn't find out and no harm would befall you. It was meant to be a one-time occurrence like hers. I got swept up in the planning and excitement. I've only ever been with you, and Dee convinced me the risk was minimal, provided we planned meticulously. Doubts began creeping in as soon as Harold picked me up from the bank and during the drive there. Harold's driving style was rather, let's say, energetic, And I couldn't help but think, what if we got into a car accident or something? We hadn't considered that possibility. It would devastate you. While Harold was checking in, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, behind the receptionist's desk. I remembered something you've often said. Do I like the person staring back at me? And at that moment, I despised the reflection looking back at me. I made the decision not to proceed, to return home and confess how foolish I had been. Then, when the receptionist glanced at me and smiled, I sensed that she knew I was contemplating cheating on my husband. Doubts were already gnawing at me, but if she could see it, so could you. The excitement Dee and I had built up dissipated, replaced by a raw fear. Even if I halted then, it might be too late to salvage my marriage, but I know you. If I had gone through with it, it would have been the end. So, at that moment, I made my exit, distancing myself from Harold. Then she called me by my real name and handed me the envelope. I had a hunch about its contents, so you were aware all along. Perhaps you had informed the receptionist. But regardless of how she knew, it was her expression that mattered most. I informed Shelley about how the receptionist had relayed to me their methods for identifying cheaters, mentioning that she and Harold had followed the exact procedure. So I didn't feel the need to elaborate. She would have discerned it immediately. Did you ever consider the consequences if we were caught? I did, but every time I raised the concern, Dee assured me it was foolproof, that you wouldn't suspect a thing, so it wouldn't harm you. Regrettably, I didn't even contemplate how our actions would affect our parents' perceptions if we were caught. She convinced me that the experience would benefit us both, that I might learn new ways to please you. Now I realize that's nonsense, because you'd question where I acquired such ideas. Dee orchestrated everything, it worked for her, and I just went along with it. However, we meticulously planned everything. No suggestive clothing, no late nights out. Any late evenings were genuine, and we always kept you informed. I'd return home early from our girls' night out or have you pick me up. We made sure not to give you any reason to worry. That contributed to your downfall. You consistently wore the same type of clothing regardless of the weather or when you were out with your friends. That alone hinted that you were hiding something. Returning home early from girls' nights out was another red flag. Your excuse of boredom just didn't seem plausible. Asking me to pick you up from happy hour just to flaunt our relationship to your coworkers by being overly affectionate towards me. And the closeness was amazing. Was it because of guilt? In part, yes, because of what I was planning to do. But mostly because I love you and enjoy being intimate with you. Or was it to compare with Harold? She gave me a puzzled look. No, that never crossed my mind. I kept going. I witnessed all of that and grew concerned, so I began to tail you, arriving earlier than our agreed time to pick you up. You were flawless. You didn't make a single misstep until 2 weeks ago at the contract celebration party. You asked me to fetch you at 10, but I arrived at 9 and loitered in the corner, unnoticed. I observed you. You only danced once with Harold, and when he thought nobody was looking, he touched your breast. You didn't object, which would have prompted most people to retaliate. That made me suspect that something was premeditated. Then, when you returned home last week and claimed to be at a symposium, all the warning signs flashed like a Christmas tree. Even if I hadn't witnessed the incident, I would have still trailed you, but it provided me with an opportunity to take a photo. You were impeccably perfect. You were never tardy, not even by a minute, which was unusual for you. Sometimes you'd be 5 or 10 minutes late when it didn't matter. If you worked late, you always called well in advance, and I'm certain if I checked, you were always working. You even asked me to pick you up when you went out for the evening, a behavior you've never exhibited before. Usually, I offered. But you almost insisted, always punctually waiting for me. I didn't have to coax you out like I typically do. And when you did go out for an evening, you dressed down, uncharacteristically plain, not as stylish as usual. You even requested my help in packing your clothes to ensure there was nothing provocative in there. That's never happened before. Then Dee had your underwear? No, there wasn't any. I just took the nightgown you saw me pack. Normally I sleep naked, as you know, but that didn't feel appropriate with another man. She glanced down at her tea and murmured softly, "So we weren't as clever as we thought. Damn, I feel so foolish for listening to Dee's advice." She looked at me and continued, "And you warned me so many times. What a complete idiot I've been." Tears streamed down her face, falling into her tea. She composed herself, took a sip of the cold tea, and made a face. I hesitated about going through with it. When the receptionist looked at me, she seemed to sense I was contemplating cheating on my husband. And if she could see it, I feared you could too. The thought of hurting you and losing you hit me hard. I realized how utterly wrong it was. "Darling, I'll do anything. I'll sign a post-nuptial agreement, leave with nothing. Anything. I'd rather not. But if it's what you need, I'll even confess to our parents. It would tarnish my image and elevate yours, but I couldn't do that to them." But that's no excuse. I can't claim ignorance. I knew exactly what I was doing. I thought you'd never find out, that it wouldn't hurt you, and it would be an adventure for me. I enjoy planning, you know that. I got carried away without seeing the consequences. Every doubt I had, Dee had a rationalization. "I'm deeply sorry, darling. I was so wrong." Then came the inevitable question. Why? It was about the experience, with the assurance that no harm would come of it. Dee promised it would be safe and enjoyable. "You're the only one I've ever been with, and it was meant to be a one-time thing." Dee convinced me the risk was minimal, especially if we planned carefully, drawing from her own experience to avoid pitfalls. Looking back, I realized Dee might have been intoxicated by the thrill of getting away with it, thinking I would feel the same, and that I'd have someone to share in the guilt of infidelity, like someone who cheated on their spouse with Harold. Sorry, this realization just hit me in hindsight. "So, what were you planning to do when you decided not to go through with it?" I asked. "I'm not entirely sure. My first instinct was to hail a taxi and go to the symposium. There's a room reserved for me there anyway, and I wouldn't have to confess what a mistake I almost made. But then I realized that would only make things worse. A strange thought crossed my mind. I hoped you could somehow leave work and rescue me. I know it sounds absurd, given that you received the letter and were aware of the situation. But those were the thoughts racing through my mind. Darling, I was utterly confused and consumed with guilt. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I was foolish to let it get this far. I'm sorry, my love." I sat there, contemplating. I knew my own desires. But what about hers? "What would you like to do now?" I inquired. "I want my husband to take me home so I can begin making amends. To apologize for my foolishness, for not heeding his advice and foolishly thinking I could deceive him. I've never meant disrespect, but I understand how it might seem from his perspective. I need to rebuild trust. It won't be easy, and I'm uncertain of the path ahead. But I can't begin unless I'm with him. Please, I'm begging you. I'll kneel right here if I have to, but please give me the chance to regain that trust and rectify my mistake." She took a deep breath, continuing, "I must cut Dee out of my life, and it's likely I've lost my job. I'm unsure how to handle that yet, but if you take me home, I'll have time to figure it out." We returned to the Land Rover, heading south once more. Shelley sat silently, tears streaming down her face until I took the next junction, reversing course onto the motorway and heading north. She noticed and turned to me, saying, "Darling, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I promise you won't regret this. I swear it with all my heart and soul." Her tears now seemed tinged with relief and hope. After about 30 minutes on the motorway, Shelley turned to me and asked, "Can I talk to you about something?" I simply nodded in response. "If you were aware of everything, why didn't you intervene?" "I believe in your independence and your ability to make decisions for yourself. I've warned you countless times, but you chose to disregard my advice. You know my stance on infidelity. Ultimately, it had to be your decision. Fortunately, you eventually made the right choice, but it caused harm to me, our marriage, and my trust in you. However, if I didn't believe our marriage could be salvaged, we wouldn't still be together. I heard sobs coming from the other side of the car. I knew it wouldn't be easy. But she had acknowledged her own mistakes. And once you recognize your faults, you know how to rectify them. We arrived home late. All I wanted was a quiet beer to help me forget the day's troubles, at least for a while. Shelley went to bed, and when I joined her later, she turned towards me and embraced me tightly. Exhausted, I drifted into a deep sleep. Shelley was up early the next morning, bringing me a steaming cup of tea in bed. She was already dressed for work. Still tired, I accepted her kiss and words of gratitude before she left. Having taken the day off, I spent my time pottering around the house and garden. I wasn't sure when to expect Shelley back, but I received a text saying she'd be home around 2, which was earlier than usual. I wondered what had occurred. Upon arriving home, she poured herself a generous glass of red wine and grabbed a beer for me, despite the early hour. It seemed she needed the drink. Recounting her day at work, she explained how Dee's reaction turned pale when she entered the manager's office. She disclosed the events leading up to her absence in Coventry. Human resources were called in, and she bravely recounted the entire ordeal, standing tall and fighting back tears. She admitted the likelihood of losing her marriage and expressed readiness to resign. Sent home with instructions to await a phone call, she left without a glance at Dee. Later, she met with a solicitor and hastily arranged an appointment with a junior member, resulting in a drafted post-nuptial agreement by the afternoon. The agreement stipulated that if she engaged in extramarital relations, she would forfeit any claim to assets. Strikingly, there was no mention of my potential infidelity. Under the printed text, she wrote, "Plus 1 free ticket to correct your mistake." I intervened by offering a threesome involving 2 women and me, to which she agreed, provided she was one of the women. After a brief exchange of opinions, I erased all the handwritten additions, making her smile. Taking a sip of wine, she turned to me and asked for guidance on how to handle Frank, an acquaintance rather than a friend, who happened to be the husband of a former acquaintance. She was uncertain about her next steps. In my opinion, I thought we needed to inform Frank, but ultimately, the decision was taken out of our hands. Dee was fired the following Monday. The usual 1-month notice didn't follow. Apparently, she didn't have enough bank funds to book hotel rooms for bed contacts. This wasn't the first time Dee had done this, and she was terminated immediately. She lied to Frank about the cause, but someone eventually informed him of the truth. It became known that her affair with Harold wasn't an isolated incident. True to his word, Frank divorced Dee, and she left town. Harold went through a divorce and lost nearly everything due to a prenuptial agreement. He had an accident, but I had nothing to do with it. Later, I learned that Frank was away on a golfing trip with friends when the accident occurred. As for us, Sherry didn't lose her job because she came forward, but she was reprimanded. She worked diligently to regain my trust, and despite her lack of confidence after Dee's departure, I believed in her. I kept an eye on her circle of friends,